Now, what I'm about to say to you is actually a bit odd, but it's also something I wanted to bring to the forefront about the mindset of colonialism and what it does to people of color, and how they've been so indoctrinated and groomed and colonized in such an ugly way that their minds, as well as their chains that they had years ago, their minds are now still chained. They still see things from the perspective of being the colonized, not the colonizer. Well, my landlady, my landlord's mother-in-law came to collect the cash today, and I pay a month. So she was. We have a laugh most of the time, we joke and say things, and her English is not brilliant, but she can get by, and I break it down slowly. Anyway, I was saying to her about I'm going to go down into Intramuros, which is the center of Metro Manila, and I was going to take a bike, the Joyride or something, to go and just check out some things down there. It's an extremely hot day today. I mean, it's like 10 o'clock and it's probably about 30 degrees here. And I think this is like spring to summer in the Philippines here, pretty much. So it's bloody hot. So sitting on a bike, you're going to burn. So unless you have clothing that's going to cover your arms, etc., you're going to feel it. Now, let me take this further. She said to me, so do you have not long clothes to stop yourself burning and getting blacker? I said, no, I don't need to. I said, I wear some things like, I got like an extra longer jacket or something. Not a jacket, like a t-shirt with longer sleeves. And I said, so what do you think about color? And she said, what do you mean? I said, brown, black, white. I said, what do you think about those colors? Do you agree with what people think about black people being less than white people or brown people? And what's your thoughts on it? And she was trying to explain. So she came up to me, she put her arm against me. She said, look, she says, oh, you're black. And I said, oh. She said, look at me. I said, yeah, so what color are you then? This is a Filipino, mind you. She says, I'm white. And I thought, okay. She's just encapsulating my idea about how capitalism and indoctrination and whiteness regime and mentality, how it's corroded these people's honest opinion of themselves. So I said, so what? Oh, a minute. So there was a table in the corner. So I walked over to it's a wooden table in brown. It was wood. And I pointed. I said, so what color is this? She goes, oh, it's brown. And then I said, oh, I see. And I pointed to so what color is this? And I pointed to my skin. She goes, that's black. And in fact, I was pretty much identical in color, not radiance, as the table, right? So I wanted to push this further. And I said, I pulled her over and I said, let me have a look at your arm again. I said, on the top of her arms is brown. It's actually quite dark. And I said, so what color is this bit? And she goes, oh, it's white. So I said, okay. So I looked under my arm. Under my arm is lighter color than on the outer extremities, which is where the sun catches it. And I said, look, the inside of my arm, this is my real color. This is the natural color I have, which is on, and that's even darker. And I put that against her inner arm, and she says, oh, she said, no, you're black and I'm white. And I said, no, look, what color do you see here? Do you think these colors, do they look the same, these colors? If we look at the inner side of my arm and the inner side of hers, she goes, no, but I'm white. I said, wow, okay. So I said, and I walked over to, there was a, what's it called? A plastic electronic machine in the corner of the room. And that was a black, dark black. And I went up and said, what color is this? She goes, that's black. I said, right. And I went back to the table. I said, what color is this? She said, that's brown. And I said, me? She said, you're black. And I said, you? She said, I'm white. I said, you know something? You really are just lying to yourselves. I said, I noticed this with a lot of Filipinos and Asian people. You don't respect what you are. And I said, I don't care whether you actually want to be white or not. But what you have to remember, you go to a white country and you start saying that you're white, you will see how stupid that will sound. Because they will tell you you're not white. But because you're here now in your own country, you're trying to promote the fact that you're white because it's in your head. It's in your head from the last maybe 50, 60, 70 years, even longer here in the Philippines. But you've had the Spanish rule, you've had the Japanese rule, you've had the American rule. And I said, your brain's washed. But obviously you don't seem to understand that. And I said, you know what? It's a pity actually, because in my world, which is some Latin America, I don't think all of us see ourselves as white. We see ourselves as a lighter color of brown or black. And there are parts of Latin America, like the Cubans, like the Venezuelans, they believe they're white. That's the reason they're having the problems in America, right? Because their skin is very light. They somehow align themselves with the whiteness. And that's why they're getting kicked out of America. That's why they're being thrown to the dogs and the wolves and thrown back to their own country, who don't really respect them now because they're saying they're better than their own people. And I said, and I think you're lucky, you're older, it's not going to harm you very much. But the younger generation, if they think like you, and if they see colors in shades of black and not a color of black, of actually being black, I said, you are not white and you are going to be in for a very big shock. And anybody in the Philippines that has this mentality still, when you go abroad, you will find yourselves in very deep problems, because people will not recognize you. They won't respect you for being other than your color. You know, it's a light shade of brown or a middle shade of brown. But in respect of white, you are black. Any shade of anything other than white is a black. So I laughed with her and I said, look, but have a great day, you know, keep fooling yourself. And she laughed, but I think it sunk in a little bit. But there's still this kind of like delusional aspect I can see that's in her face, that, you know, if I tell myself this enough and keep telling myself, everything's hunky-dory. So that was a real revelation to me, to actually see the Filipino and older women as well say that. A younger one, I can imagine, but the older ones, wow. And she's what, you know, she's gonna be like 50s, 60s. Anyway guys, something else to think about, right? See you later.